Look at the pages of history. Some are filled with dates. Some with victories. Some with pride. But others are torn out, hidden, or written in whispers. This is one of those stories. Not because it did not happen, but because too many tried to erase it. This is the story of the Armenian Genocide. Before the marches. Before the deaths. Before the silence. There were lives. Families. Churches. Schools. Communities that had existed for centuries. Armenians lived across the Ottoman Empire. In towns. In villages. In cities filled with memory. They were farmers. Merchants. Teachers. Artists. Neighbors. They were not soldiers. They were civilians. And yet, they became targets. At the beginning of the 20th century, the empire was weakening. Fear was growing. And fear always looks for someone to blame. Armenians were accused of disloyalty. Of betrayal. Of being a threat. Not because of proof. But because they were different. This is how persecution begins. Not with violence. But with accusation. In 1915, the arrests began. Armenian intellectuals were taken first. Writers. Doctors. Priests. Community leaders. Taken from their homes. Taken from their families. Never to return. This was not random. It was calculated. Because when you silence the voice of a people, you make them easier to destroy. Then came the orders. Deportation. Relocation. Words that sounded temporary. Administrative. Almost harmless. But behind those words was death. Entire communities were forced to leave their homes. Not for days. Not for weeks. But forever. They were told to pack lightly. They were told it was for their safety. They were told lies. Men were separated. Often taken away. Often killed immediately. Women. Children. Elderly. Were forced onto the roads. Marches through deserts. Through mountains. Through hunger. Through thirst. No food. No water. No protection. This was not relocation. It was destruction by exhaustion. People collapsed where they walked. Children died in their mothers' arms. Mothers were forced to keep walking. Because stopping meant death. And walking also meant death. Villages were emptied. Churches destroyed. Homes taken. A civilization was being erased. Step by step. Some were killed outright. Others died slowly. From starvation. From disease. From exposure. And all of it happened. In the open. Witnessed by soldiers. By officials. By neighbors. Some tried to help. Many could not. Some chose not to. Because fear spreads faster than compassion. The world received reports. Diplomats sent warnings. Missionaries wrote letters. They described mass killings. Forced marches. Dead bodies along the roads. And yet, the killings continued. Because outrage without action is not protection. By the end of the genocide, over 1 million Armenians were dead. Not in battle. Not in war zones. But as civilians. Families destroyed. Communities erased. History broken. And when the violence ended, the silence began. Survivors scattered across the world. Carrying trauma. Carrying memory. Carrying loss. They rebuilt lives in exile. But they never forgot. And neither should we. Because genocide does not end when killing stops. It continues when truth is denied. And denial became the final weapon. For decades, the suffering was questioned, minimized, ignored. Not because evidence was missing, but because acknowledgement was inconvenient. This is why this story matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to recognize them. Not to create hatred, but to defend truth. Because when genocide is denied, it is allowed to happen again. And this story is not finished yet. Because memory is still fighting silence. And in the next part, we will follow the survivors, the witnesses, and the long struggle to be heard. Follow the roads of exile. Not on a map, but through memory. Because these were not journeys. They were death marches. After the arrests. After the orders. Entire Armenian communities were forced to walk. No destination explained. No protection offered. Only commands to move forward. Women carried children. Elderly leaned on sticks. The sick were left behind. And behind them, their homes stood empty. The marches stretched for weeks. 4 months. Through mountains. Through deserts. Food was rare. Water was scarcer. Disease spread quickly. Those who fell behind were beaten. Or killed. This was not chaos. It was method. Men had already been removed. Now the rest were left defenseless. Children cried from hunger. Mothers had nothing to give. Some tried to feed their children leaves. Others whispered prayers. Many children did not survive. Women faced horrors beyond exhaustion. Violence followed the marches. Abuse went unpunished. Because law no longer protected them. Entire families disappeared along the roads. Bodies lined the paths. Left unburied. Unmourned. And still, the marches continued. Some survivors later said, the desert was not empty. It was full of the dead. Deir ez-Zor became a final destination for many. A place without shelter. Without food. Without hope. People arrived only to die. This was extermination by abandonment. Outside observers saw it. Diplomats. Missionaries. Doctors. They wrote letters. Sent reports. Used words like annihilation. Like extermination. They warned the world. And the world knew. Newspapers published accounts. Governments received cables. Leaders discussed the situation. But discussion did not stop death. War consumed attention. Politics delayed action. And Armenians continued to die. This is one of the most painful truths. That genocide can happen. Not in secrecy. But in visibility. Because knowing is not the same as acting. Some individuals tried to help. Some hid children. Some shared food. Some risked their lives. But individual courage could not stop a system. By the time the marches ended, communities that had existed for centuries were gone. Churches destroyed. Graveyards erased. Languages silenced in entire regions. A culture was shattered. Those who survived carried scars that never healed. Physical. Emotional. Generational. They reached foreign lands. Syria. Lebanon. Europe. The Americas. They rebuilt with nothing but memory. And memory became their resistance. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. They told the world. Because forgetting felt like betrayal. But after the war, justice did not come. Trials were limited. Punishments rare. And soon, the subject faded from global attention. Silence returned. And with silence, denial grew. The deaths were questioned. The intent disputed. The suffering minimized. Not because evidence disappeared, but because recognition was inconvenient. This denial became the final wound. Because when suffering is denied, it is repeated in memory. Again and again. The Armenian Genocide was not only a crime of killing. It was a crime of erasure. Erasure of people. Erasure of culture. Erasure of truth. And that erasure still hurts today. This is why remembrance matters. Not as politics, but as humanity. Because genocide is not defined only by numbers. It is defined by intent. By planning. By the destruction of a people as such. And intent was clear. The marches were not meant to relocate. They were meant to eliminate. The documents say it. The witnesses saw it. The survivors lived it. And yet, the struggle for recognition continues. Because history is not only written by events. It is written by who is believed. And believing survivors is an act of justice. In the next part, we will look at the aftermath. The long silence. The global Armenian diaspora. And the fight to preserve memory against denial. When the violence slowed, the suffering did not end. For the survivors, the genocide followed them. Across borders. Across oceans. Across generations. They emerged from the marches broken. Orphaned. Widowed. Homeless. Many had lost everyone. Parents. Children. Siblings. Entire families erased. There were no homes to return to. No villages waiting. No safety promised. Only exile. Survivors gathered in refugee camps. In foreign lands. Speaking a language few understood. Carrying memories no one wanted to hear. They rebuilt life piece by piece. With trauma in their hearts. And grief in their silence. This was the beginning of the Armenian diaspora. From the Middle East to Europe. From the Americas to Australia. Communities formed far from ancestral lands. They opened churches. Schools. Cultural centers. Not just to survive. But to remember. Because memory was all they had left. Parents told children stories. Not to fill them with hatred. But to protect the truth. They spoke of villages that no longer existed. Of traditions interrupted. Of names that could not be buried. And always. They spoke of loss. But the world moved on. New wars began. New crises demanded attention. And the Armenian Genocide faded from headlines. Without justice. Without accountability. Some perpetrators were never punished. Some were forgotten. Some lived normal lives. And silence grew heavier. Then came denial. Not quiet denial. But organized denial. The deaths were questioned. The intent denied. The word genocide rejected. Despite documents. Despite eyewitnesses. Despite survivor testimony. This denial did not erase history. It deepened the wound. Because denying genocide is continuing it in memory. It tells survivors their pain is negotiable. That their loss is debatable. That their truth is inconvenient. And this denial had consequences. Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the word genocide, did so with the Armenians in mind. He asked a question that still echoes. Why is killing 1 million people a lesser crime than killing one person? His work led to international law, to the Genocide Convention, to the promise that such crimes would be prevented and punished. And yet, the first genocide of the 20th century remained unrecognized by many. This contradiction matters. Because when genocide is denied, it sends a message. That power can erase truth. That silence can win. That victims must fight twice. Once to survive. And once to be believed. For Armenians, this second struggle never ended. Recognition became a lifelong mission. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not to accuse generations, but to acknowledge history. Because acknowledgement is not punishment. It is responsibility. Slowly, countries began to recognize the genocide. Parliaments passed resolutions. Scholars published research. Archives opened. But recognition came unevenly. Politically. Carefully. Often reluctantly. And each delay reopened wounds. Because time does not heal denial. It deepens it. The Armenian Genocide also left another legacy. A warning. A warning about what happens when early signs are ignored. When discrimination is normalized. When deportation is justified. When violence is hidden behind bureaucracy. These patterns did not disappear in 1915. They appeared again. In different places. Under different names. And each time, the Armenian story whispered. This has happened before. The survivors understood this. That their memory was not only personal. It was universal. They spoke not only as Armenians, but as witnesses for humanity. Because genocide is not about one people. It is about a failure of the world. A failure to protect civilians. A failure to act on warning signs. A failure to put human life above politics. The Armenian Genocide became a case study. In law. In history. In moral responsibility. And still, the fight for full recognition continues. Not because the truth is unclear. But because truth is uncomfortable. Because acknowledging genocide forces nations to face the past. To question heroes. To accept responsibility. And not all are ready to do that. But survivors and their descendants continue. They march peacefully. They speak publicly. They educate. Because silence is no longer an option. They know that memory fades without effort. And that forgetting invites repetition. This is why remembrance days exist. Why memorials are built. Why stories are told again and again. Not to live in grief. But to prevent future grief. Because genocide does not start with killing. It starts with denial. And denial is where prevention must begin. In the final part of this story, we will confront the meaning of remembrance. The responsibility of the present. And the question that history asks all of us. What do we do with this truth? Now we arrive at the most difficult question. Not what happened, but what it asks of us today. Because the Armenian Genocide is not only a story of the past. It is a test of memory. A test of honesty. A test of humanity. When the killing ended, there was no true ending. No justice that matched the loss. No closure that could replace 1,000,000 lives. No return to what was destroyed. Only memory remained. And memory became a responsibility. For survivors. Remembering was painful. But forgetting was impossible. They carried stories that haunted their sleep. Names they could not bury. Faces that never aged. And they understood something deeply. If the world forgot. If the world denied. Then the crime would never truly end. This is why remembrance matters. Not as politics. Not as argument. but as protection. Because genocide does not begin with death. It begins with silence. With denial. With the refusal to see others as human. The Armenian Genocide teaches us this pattern. First, a group is labeled different. Then dangerous. Then expendable. Rights are removed. Voices are silenced. And violence is justified as necessity. By the time the world reacts, it is already too late. This is why recognition matters. Recognition does not punish the present. It honors the past. It says, "We see you. We believe you. Your suffering mattered." It restores dignity to victims. And it restores truth to history. Without recognition, history remains broken. Because denial is not neutrality. Denial is participation in erasure. When genocide is denied, it tells survivors their pain is negotiable. That their memories are optional. That truth depends on convenience. And this is dangerous. Because every denial sends a message to the future. That crimes can be hidden. That suffering can be questioned. That power can silence truth. The Armenian Genocide stands as a warning. A warning to governments. To institutions. To societies. That silence has consequences. That ignoring early signs leads to catastrophe. That fear can be turned into policy. That bureaucracy can become a weapon. This is why the story is still told. Why it must be told. Not to accuse children of the past. Not to create endless anger. But to prevent repetition. Because history does not repeat itself exactly. It adapts. Genocide appears in new forms. In new places. With new justifications. But the pattern remains. And memory is the only defense. For Armenians around the world, memory became identity. Songs remembered villages that no longer exist. Stories preserved names that were never recorded. Commemorations replaced graves that were never marked. This was not a choice. It was survival. Because when history tries to erase you, remembering becomes resistance. The Armenian Genocide also changed the world in quieter ways. It influenced international law. Human rights discourse. The very definition of genocide. It shaped how the world understands crimes against humanity. And yet, its recognition remains incomplete. This contradiction matters. Because selective memory weakens justice. And partial truth invites future crimes. The lesson is not Armenian alone. It is human. It asks us to look beyond borders. Beyond politics. Beyond comfort. And ask. What does it mean to be responsible for history? Responsibility does not mean guilt. It means honesty. It means listening to survivors. Teaching the truth. Standing against denial wherever it appears. It means choosing humanity over nationalism. Truth over convenience. Memory over silence. The Armenian Genocide challenges us to be better than the past. To recognize early warning signs. To speak when others are targeted. To act when silence feels easier. Because the greatest danger is not remembering tragedy. The greatest danger is normalizing it. Turning suffering into numbers. Turning loss into debate. Turning truth into opinion. More than 1 million lives were destroyed. Not as an accident. Not as collateral damage. But as intent. They were people. With names. With dreams. With futures. And remembering them is not optional. It is a moral duty. The Armenian Genocide asks us something simple. And difficult. Will we listen to history? Or argue with it? Will we honor memory? Or protect denial? Will we learn? or repeat. Because never again is not a phrase. It is a responsibility. A responsibility to speak. To educate. To acknowledge. And to stand with truth. Even when truth is uncomfortable. This is how remembrance becomes justice. Not by reopening wounds. But by refusing to deny them. Not by living in grief. But by building awareness. Not by blaming generations. But by protecting the future. The Armenian Genocide is one of humanity's darkest chapters. Not because of how it began. But because of how long it was silenced. And today. By telling this story honestly. By remembering fully. By refusing denial. We do something powerful. We return voice to the silenced. We return dignity to the victims. We return truth to history. And in doing so, we honor not only Armenians, but humanity itself. Because a world that remembers genocide is a world that has a chance to prevent it. And that is why this story must never fade into silence.